under the guidance of Arpita. Divya is broadly interested in secure multi-party computation and distributed computing, and she has worked on several research problems investigating feasibility of MPC in different network models and different computational models. Today, she will talk about fully secure MPC with minimal trust. Divya, all yours.
Thank you for the introduction. So yes, this talk is about fully secure MPC with minimal trust, and it's based on a joint work with Yuval Ashai, Arpita Patra, Shikhar Patranabis, and Aksharam Srinivasan. So I'm excited to be giving it with some of my co-authors here. Um, so let me begin with what secure multi-party computation or MPC means. Suppose you have n mutually distrusting parties out of which t are corrupt and each of them have their own private input, and the goal is that they want to compute some combined function f on their private inputs. MPC gives them a way to do so while ensuring two main properties. The first is correctness, meaning that the protocol output would be the correct function output. And the next is privacy, which means that nothing beyond the function output will be revealed. Now, the area of MPC has been quite well studied, and there are different kinds of protocols with different types of guarantees. So, based on how robust the protocol is, these are the security notions of protocols known. The strongest and the most desirable one is guaranteed output delivery or full security. So, this is what we will be referring to as GOD. So, in such protocols, no matter what the adversary does, he cannot prevent the honest parties from obtaining the output. Everyone always gets the output in the end. A slightly weaker notion is that of fairness, in which it is fair in the sense that if the corrupt person gets the output, then so do the honest people. So, this is an all or a none type of situation where everybody gets the output or nobody gets the output. Now, there is another notion called identifiable abort, which is sort of incompatible with fairness in the sense that it may happen that the adversary gets the output while the honest people don't. But the guarantee is that if the honest people don't get the output, then they identify at least one corrupt cheater. So in this case, they would have identified that the bear Bruce is corrupt. So this is the notion of identifiable abort. The next notion is that of unanimous abort, which is strictly weaker, in which it may happen that the honest people don't obtain the output and they don't even understand who is corrupt. But the only guarantee is that the honest people among themselves would be in agreement. So either both these honest people will get the output or both of them will not get the output. And the last and weakest notion is selective abort, where even the honest people are not in agreement. So it may happen that one of them got the output and not the other. So this is the sort of hierarchy of notions, and it's clear that the most desirable one is that of guaranteed output delivery or GOD. So if you're designing protocols, you would always want to design protocols with GOD. However, there is a classic negative result by Cleve in 86, which says that you cannot actually get GOD always. So what it says is that fairness and GOD are impossible if majority of the parties are corrupt. So this means that we cannot get GOD in all settings. So what do we do if we want to get GOD, but what do we do in light of this impossibility? So one option is that you assume an honest majority, because in fact GOD is possible if majority of the parties are honest. So maybe you consider this setting, and this line of work has been very well explored. There are many protocols in the honest majority setting which are able to get GOD. But another option is, if what if you want to continue to remain in the dishonest majority setting? What do you do? So in that case, if you want to bypass this impossibility, maybe you can use some extra assumption like an external help. So maybe that helps you get this strong guarantee and circumvents this impossibility of cliff. So what I mean is that maybe you have a protocol which is like a regular MPC protocol, just with this extra feature that you are calling an external help, maybe say from time to time, and that's somehow able to give you this stronger guarantee. So I should mention that, like, feel free to ask me questions in between, because it's a long talk, and I don't think I need the entire 1 hour as well. So please feel free if you have any doubts. So this
Divya, can
is,
I ask?
yeah, sure, yeah.
So this is meaningful only if this external help is sort of, little low of the complexity of computing the function itself, right?
Yes, yes. So we will be looking at, so that would be a trivial solution in which you're just making it do the whole functionality itself. So we will be looking at what type of models should we assume for this external help.
So you'll be constraining this help in certain
Outside.
ways. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So that's exactly what the next slide is, that how do we model this trusted party? Like, how do we think about it or use it? So we actually focus on two main dimensions. The first dimension is, what do we make it do? Like Chaya was pointing, that maybe we just make it do the function itself. So, but maybe we don't want to do that, and we want to impose some sort of restrictions on what we want to make the trusted party do. So even the genie is imposing some restrictions on what wishes he can grant. So maybe we want to impose some sort of restriction. So this is one dimension that we are looking at. And the second dimension is that how many times we use this trusted party during our protocol. Basically, how many wishes are we getting? So now let's analyze what are the existing solutions based on these two parameters. The first is the trivial solution, which was just mentioned, that maybe you just make this trusted party do the function that that you're designing the MPC for. So you just make it do the function directly, and you just need to call it one time with your inputs on clear, and then this genie will just compute the function for you and give the output. So this is a trivial solution which gets guaranteed output delivery. So it is good in terms of the number of calls, because you're using it just the minimum number of times, which is one time. But it's not good in terms of what you're making the functionality do, because maybe the circuit that you're trying to compute is some sort of heavy computation, and you don't want to use the trusted service for such a heavy operation, for example. So maybe we want to avoid that. Next, there was another work by Ishai and others in 2012. And there they were actually having a protocol with guaranteed output delivery, which is using this trusted service. But whatever work this trusted service was doing was what we call as small, meaning that it's independent of the function that we are trying to compute. So it is doing some small lightweight operation, which is sort of universal, meaning that it will not you will use the TP in the same way, no matter which function you're designing the MPC for. So that is good, that you're making it do some small, lightweight, universal operation. But on the downside, this construction was invoking the using this service or invoking this genie uh, a number of times, which is related to the number of parties. So it was doing it n minus 1 times. So that's many if you have in a setting where you have many number of parties. So that was one solution. They also had another solution in which they were actually calling the trusted service just one time. But in this one called solution, the work that they were making this TP do was becoming exponential in the number of parties. So it's not really lightweight anymore. It was scaling with exponentially with the number of parties. So these are what are the existing solutions that can get you guaranteed output delivery using a trusted service. But the ideal goal would be if you just use the minimum number of calls of one, and you also use the trusted service in a lightweight manner, meaning that you make it do some small computation which is independent of the function being computed. So from now, when we are referring to small, I mean that it's independent of the function that the MPC is trying to compute. So this is motivated by, if you think that this trusted service or Genie is going to be realized using a cloud service provider who is charging some fee for whatever computation he is doing. So this is expensive. So you want to minimize how many times you're using this service and what you're making it do. Or you can also imagine that this trusted service is being realized by some large scale honest majority MPC protocol. So you run the protocol, but just for the functions that you want to do using this trusted service, you take a detour and use a large scale honest majority just for that instead. So what we are trying to say is that this trusted party is an expensive resource and we want to minimize its use in terms of how many times you call it and what you make it do, what functionality you make it compute. So this is our goal, that we want to understand if it's possible to get guaranteed output delivery in dishonest majority using just one call to a small TP. Okay. So it actually started off in a negative note because it turns out that this is impossible for some types of protocols. So this solution of Isha and others, which was actually scaling exponentially with the number of parties, that falls under this class of protocols where we say that the decoder is universal. So I'll explain what this means. So you can imagine that you ran the MPC, you ran some interaction among the parties, and then in between you call this trusted service, and the trusted service gave you some response. Now, from the response, the parties need to do some computation to get the output. So that's the decoding part in which they are deriving the output from the response of this genie. So if we are assuming a universal decoder, meaning that whatever the computation the parties are doing to derive the output is independent of the function being computed, then for such types of protocols, we showed that the solution of Isha and others is actually kind of tight because we showed that you will need to make the TP do exponential in number of parties amount of work if you're limiting yourself to just one call. So that means that their solution was tight for those type of protocols. And this actually holds irrespective of whatever is your computational assumption or the setup that you assume. So what I,
Divya,
yeah,
sorry, just to make
yeah,
sure I understand.
yeah,
So when you
yeah,
say small TP, you mean it computes a function that is independent of f that we want to compute inside the MPC, right?
yes,
Then
yes.
what does exponential size TP mean?
So this is actually that there it's not directly related to the function, but somehow it will, the computation scales with the number of parties. So I should have written exponential in n. So it's actually, we will also see the solution. So maybe it becomes more clear, but the TP is not doing, it's actually not able to get, we want to ideally make it get polynomial in the number of parties. We don't want it, uh, so maybe I should be more specific. So when I say small, we don't want it to depend on the circuit size, and we also want it just to be, say, polynomial in the security parameter and the number of parties. But this one is exponential in the number of parties.
Okay, okay. Because potentially you could have something that's exponential in n, but still independent of f, right?
Yes, actually, that's the category that this solution will fall. Like we will
Okay,
see it. You're right.
okay.
So yes, so that's it's good to make it clear and get the feedback before my TCC talk. So yes, so when I mean small, it means polynomial in the number of parties and the security parameter, and it is independent of the roadblock that we hit. So what this means is that we should do the decoding in some other way. So if what happens if we allow the decoding to be function dependent, then is it possible to limit yourself to one call and still use the small TP? But here we have another negative result which says that if you are in the information theoretic setting and you consider no setup, that is, you're in the plain model, then it's still impossible to get a one call God solution with small TP. So now what options do we have? Like if we want any hope of a positive result, it means that we should either, maybe we should try to go to the computational setting, or the other option is that we remain in the information theoretic setting, but we assume that there is a setup. So first let's talk about what happens in the computational setting. And here we finally had some good news. Computational setting where also the decoding is function dependent, and this particular construction is based on functional encryption. So that was a positive result, and this one is actually still open, so we still don't know what happens in the information theoretic setting with setup, whether we can get God with one call to a small TP. So this is basically the broad picture of the questions related to this specific model of one call to the small TP. Okay. Um, Now I actually want to go over the construction of Isha and others, which is previous work, where I think it gives a good warm up to understand our negative result as well as how these type of protocols work in general. And then we will look at one of our negative result, which says that if you are in a specific class of protocols, then the exponential size becomes inherent. And then we will also look at the high level of the positive result based on functional encryption. So this is the plan. So let's look at what Isha and others did in 2012. So there is a protocol which is getting guaranteed output delivery, and it's using the trusted service. So the way it begins is that you will start with an MPC protocol that is giving you the best guarantee in the dishonest majority. And the best guarantee in dishonest majority is this identifiable abort. So you begin with that and recall that this means that either the honest people will get the output or they will identify a cheater. So what you use this MPC for is that you don't use it to compute the function output directly, because if you did that, then you would be violating fairness and GOD. So instead of computing the function directly, what this MPC does is that it computes an additive sharing of this function output. So what it means is, say y is your output of this function. So it will be computing an additive sharing of that. So imagine that it's broken up into n parts, out of which one part is given to every party. So this is what you do in the beginning. And then now if you consider one run of such a protocol, then it could be that either all the honest people got their additive shares, so it was a successful run, or it could be that they identified a cheater. So say they identified a cheater, then you would just eliminate that cheater from the participants, and then you will again rerun this from the beginning among the remaining participants. So here note that even if there are unsuccessful runs, we know that the adversary got nothing about Y, because he's always missing one share. He can corrupt only up to n minus 1 parties. So you can do this as many times as needed, and it would be a maximum of t times, where t is the number of cheaters, say. And at the end, you will definitely get a successful run where the honest people are able to get their additive shares. So you just repeat until that. Next, once the run was successful, these parties would, whoever was remaining, they would actually invoke the genie and they will just pass on their additive shares. And the idea is that the genie is going to check if everyone sent him shares in the first place, and second, if the shares are consistent. So what I mean by consistent is if they are the same as what was given as the output of the MPC protocol, the idea about MPC protocol. So for that, you can imagine that these additive shares are tagged with signatures. So there is a verification key, a common verification key for all, and each of the additive shares will be signed and given to the respective party. So they will also pass on this to the genie, who can first check that everyone gave him the same verification key. And if everyone gave him the same, then he checks the signatures. And if everything is good, then he would just add up these shares and come and reconstruct the output and give it to the parties. Okay. But what if everything was not good? And it's possible that, for example, the adversary is corrupting P2, P4, and P5. And what he did is that he tampered with the verification keys on behalf of P4 and P5. So now what does the genie do? Because everyone did not send him consistent information. So what the genie does is that it creates this partition. So it puts the parties, whoever sent him the same verification key, in the same set. So it puts P1, P2, and P3 in the same set, and P4 and P5 in another set. And then it outputs this partition. So note that the genie has no idea like which of the sets has the honest people, because he doesn't know if the pink verification key was output from the MPC with identity ID abort or it was the green one. So he just knows that there is some sort of disagreement. So he just forms these sets based on whoever agree with each other. But note that the honest people will always be in the same set because they will definitely send the same verification key. And maybe a corrupt person could be in the same set, like here P2 has got in the set with honest people, but some of the corrupt people are in a different set. Now, how is this information useful? Like if I'm an honest person, P1, and the genie just told me that this is the partition, then it's useful because I know that whoever is not in my set must be corrupt because they have sent some different verification key and honest people would never do that. So that's why it's still some useful information that the honest people are getting. So what they can now do is that now they can just rerun from the beginning using the participants in their set. So now you can imagine that the whole protocol is being rerun among P1, P2, and P3. And there is still one cheater here. So it's not that you eliminated all of them, but still you made some progress. You eliminated two of them. So this is basically the solution in which, in the worst case, maybe you just keep eliminating one cheater at a time. If there's a set with only one party by itself, and then in the worst case, it can go up to n minus one calls, say. And note that what type of work are we making the genie do? It's doing these things to check signatures, to check consistency about the verification key, and adding up the shares. So everything is lightweight and something independent of the function being computed. So are there any doubts in this solution? Okay. So this is the end call solution of Isha and others. Now they have the more interesting one is the one call solution, in which you cannot do this, that you make the genie output the partition, because you don't have this chance to rerun anymore because you just have the one call. So the intuition is that somehow you need to be prepared for all types of scenarios. So you don't know in advance with respect to whom the adversary is going to misbehave during the call to the genie. So you don't know which subset, with respect to which subset he's going to misbehave. So you just need to prepare for all possible situations. So what I mean is that in this one call solution, instead of computing the additive shares of just this output y, you can imagine many possible outputs. So here the first one is the output that you would imagine should be the correct one if, for example, the adversary behaved just on behalf of, misbehaved just on behalf of P5. So this is an output which is using the actual inputs for the first four parties, and for the last one, it's substituting it with the default input for P5. So this is the output that you would want the honest people to get. Suppose the adversary misbehaved with respect to P5. Now, the next one is the one in which suppose he misbehaved with respect to P4, then maybe the output that you're shooting for is the one where only X4 was substituted with default. So you just imagine all these possible situations, meaning that all the possible subsets that the adversary could corrupt, and then you substitute some of them with the default input and keep the real inputs for the others and enumerate all of them. So there will be 2 power n such things, because for every input you have two options to either keep the real or the default. So now what's done is that an additive sharing is done not just for y, but for each of these output versions. And the way the additive sharing will be done is, suppose it's the first one where the X5 was substituted with default, then it would be additively shared among the remaining 4 parties. So this would be imagining the situation that P5 was aborting. So now you just have information from the first 4, and you're trying to reconstruct this output based on what you got from the first 4. Okay, so this is how the MPC with IdeaBot will be computing the function. It will imagine all possible outputs and do additive sharing of all the possible outputs in this manner. The rest is almost the same, but instead of passing these additive shares, now these are all vectors because you have additive shares for each potential output, say. And now what the genie will do, again, if everything was good, there is no problem, you just output y. Otherwise, you identify the partition. So this partition, we took the same example as before, but now instead of outputting the partition, what this genie should do is that it should identify what are the relevant additive shares that it should use. So since the first 3 parties are in this set, so it should try to look at the additive shares in which the first three inputs were real and the last two were default. So it uses the additive shares given by these parties for this potential output and then adds them up and gives this to them. And similarly, for the other set, it would identify the potential output in which the first three were substituted with default and the last two were the real ones. And the additive shares of these two would be just given by P4 and P5. So it will add that up and give it to the parties. Okay. So the main idea is that you prepare for all situations, and then one of the situations will get sort of activated depending on what subset the adversary is corrupting, but you have sent so much information that you can recover for all possible cases. Okay, so this is the solution with one call. And if you see that even to parse these vector of shares, like you have an additive share for every possible output, and there are 2 power n possible outputs. So this computation done by the Genie is not small because it's not poly in n anymore. It's actually exponential in the number of parties. Okay, so are there any doubts in this solution? Okay, so this is the one call solution, which I think gives a good intuition for our negative result. So what we are trying to say is that, also note here that we said that the decoder is universal, because if you see what the Genie is doing is returning this output directly, and the parties actually don't have to do anything to derive the output from the TP response. So they're not doing anything depending on the function. So this is an example of a protocol in which the decoding is function independent, because after you got the response of the Genie, you're not doing anything related to the function. So what we show is that for such protocols in which the decoder was universal, and that means function independent, for that we show that in fact this solution is tight and you will need to incur computation which is exponential in the number of parties. So let's look at this negative result of ours, which says that if you have a universal decoder, it's impossible to make one call to a small TP. So how does that was a particular protocol, but the impossibility should rule out all possible protocols. So let's look at how a general protocol in this setting seems. So you can think of it as having roughly 3 phases. The first phase is whatever happens before the invocation to the Genie, before calling the TP. So here you can imagine that these parties are talking to each other, they're engaging in some interaction using their inputs potentially, and then at the end, each of them have a view which includes their input, randomness, and the protocol transcript, that is whatever messages were exchanged between them. Next, what the parties would do is that they would invoke this Genie by sending him some messages. Now, whatever messages these parties are sending would be a function of the view that they had at the end of the first phase. Okay, so this is what happens during the call to the TP. Once the Genie has received the messages, it will do some sort of computation and it will compute its response. And the final phase is when the parties, they decode this response. So they would be deriving the output from this. So this we refer to as the post TP call phase, in which they derive some additional information based on whatever view they had at the end of the first phase. Okay, so this is how a general TP aided MPC protocol would look like with one call. And our assumption is that the TP is small, meaning that we are saying that all these messages that are being sent to the Genie, as well as whatever computation he's doing and responding, everything should be independent of the MPC function, and it should also be polynomial in the number of parties. That's our assumption because we are assuming a small TP. And further, we're assuming that even this information that was used by the parties to derive the output, we're assuming that even that is independent of the function being computed. So it's sort of small, because that is because of our universal decoder assumption. Okay, so everything that has been shaded is basically something that is polynomial in n and independent of the function being computed. So this is how a generic protocol would look like in with these assumptions. Now the high level intuition is that you saw this protocol. So it is that when you are invoking the TP, you don't know in advance with respect to which subset the adversary is going to misbehave. And you need to be prepared for all of them. So at that point, you sort of have 2 power n possible branches and ways in which the protocol could potentially proceed. And there are 2 power n possible outputs at that point. And then one of them gets activated based on the what the adversary decides to do during the TP call. But then all this information, you are somehow sending it to the genie before you know which was the correct subset. And then the genie has to do some computation and give a response in a way that works for all possible situations. So roughly you can think of it as if we have compressed 2 power n possible outputs in the short information that we are sending to the genie. So this is the intuition that we use to prove this negative result. And more specifically, we construct an encoding decoding scheme that compresses 2 power n values. So you can imagine that say B1 to B2 power n, these are the inputs to your encoding scheme. And what we are going to do, that is a set on one side. And you can imagine this other set on the left, which are all the possible input tuple combinations. So for each of the inputs, you have two options of either using the real input or default. So you enumerate all the 2 power n possibilities on your left. And you define this mapping going from each potential tuple to one of the values that you want to encode. So you define this sort of function, which is mapping from these 2 power n input tuples to these 2 power n bits, say, which are being encoded. Okay. So this is how you define this mapping. And the idea is that if you want to design an encoding decoding scheme for these 2 power n values, what you do is that you run this TP aided MPC protocol for this particular function f that you defined in this way. So say that these are the values b1 to b2n. So you define the function f in that manner, which we just saw. And then you emulate this pre-TP call phase and the TP call phase, and you figure out what are going to be the messages that the short information that you would have sent to the TP. So that short information is actually a part of your encoding. And another part of your encoding is also the function independent part that you use to derive the output. So these are the things that would be analogous to the encoding of these 2 power n values. And the way that the decoding would work is that in general, the genie has some sort of mechanism that even if only a subset of people invoke him, he does some computation to compute a response. So what you do is that among these 4 messages in this example, you imagine that some of them were missing, and you imagine all possible subsets, that what would the genie do in that particular case, what response would the genie give, and using that you can derive one of the B values. So say that you take all the 4 messages, then you would derive the B value B1, which was corresponding to the tuple where all the real inputs were used. Then now if you consider the subset where the first one was missing, then that is corresponding to when the first input was substituted with default. So you get the B2 value and so on. So that's how you can recover all the 2 power n values by imagining this in your head. So this actually violates a known incompressibility theorem, which says that it's impossible to design encoding decoding schemes which are able to compress these 2 power n values, meaning that it says that at least one of these terms, either one of the encoding terms or what additional information you are using for decoding, something needs to scale exponentially with the number of values being something needs to scale linearly with the number of values being encoded. So that means that one of these terms had to be of the order 2 power n. So there was no way that the TP could have been small, and even the partial view used for the decoding could have been small. So this is just,
Divya,
yeah.
where in the compression did you actually use the universality of the decoder?
So in the encoding, the encoding has sort of many parts. So one of the parts is what you're sending to the genie, and also this part about the so there's generally also a randomness included, which would be used in the decoding. So we are assuming that these partial views are can be computed using that randomness. So even this partial view that was used to derive the output, that is also a part of your encoding of B1 to B2 power n.
I see.
So so potentially in the post TP processing, you use the response of the TP and you use some additional information that is some maybe some function of the view that you had at the end of the first phase. But because of our universal decoder assumption, we are assuming that this cannot be too big. This additional information is independent of the function being computed. It must be something that is also polynomial in n and not too big. That's our assumptions, because that's only the class of protocols that we are considering in this impossibility. And since that is a part of the encoding, that's why even that cannot be too big. So to get this contradiction, we need that none of the encoding terms can be too big. And this is a part of the encoding.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
sorry, I still don't understand what is too big. So let's say I allow for a non-universal decoder, right? What fails in this compression now?
so if you consider a non, okay. So the thing is that in this encoding that you are sending, then you cannot maybe express this partial view. Maybe okay, let me try to think of an example. So for example, what if this thing that you were using for the decoding was like a truth table or something big? Then you could not have considered that as a part of your encoding, because this theorem allows that the encoding can be 2 power n. So you would
Oh,
have given
maybe I misunderstood what you meant by universal decoder. I thought it's only independence from F. Does it also mean small?
yeah, it also means small. So it's polynomial in n as well as independent of f. So when I say small, I mean poly in n kappa.
Okay, so now in your argument, you only use that it is small, right? Where do you need the fact that it's independent of F?
Mm, but I mean, I think that you cannot, if for example, it was depending on f, um, because I mean, for example, you will see particular case. Now I mean, maybe I can take this once I think a bit more while I'm
Sure,
talking
sure.
about the construction,
Yeah.
because we have an example of a positive result where this was depending on the function.
Okay, okay.
And in that case, one second. Yeah, maybe I will
Yeah,
take it up.
we can do this later. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So let me go ahead. So next, let's look at the positive construction and try to understand like why that is circumventing this impossibility. So this is a positive result based on functional encryption. So here, what happens is, first, let me recall the syntax of functional encryption. So say that you have a setup algorithm. Then there is a key generation algorithm that takes in the master secret key and F and gives you the secret key specific for F. And there is an encryption that takes in the input and the master public key, and it will give you the ciphertext. And then finally is the decryption, which will take in the ciphertext and the secret key for F. And if everything is good, then you hope that this decryption is actually F evaluated on this input X. So these are mainly the algorithms related to a functional encryption scheme. And we will be having a GOD solution, which makes one call to the TP using such a scheme. So let's look at this. So again, we will begin with an MPC with ID about protocol, but the way that we're using it is very different. We are using it to initialize the setup of this functional encryption scheme. So this will actually return the master public key and the secret key for F to the parties. Okay. So this again, it's the same that you keep rerunning this until you're successful in case this results in an abort. Next, what these parties would do is that they would send the master public key and their inputs on clear to this genie. And then, but some of them could misbehave. So for example, maybe the adversary is sending a wrong master public key on behalf of P4. So now what the Genie would do is, again, it creates these partition based on whoever sent it the consistent public keys, master public keys. So it will create a ciphertext using the blue master public key. And for that as input, it would concatenate the real inputs, like whatever it got for the first three parties. And for the fourth one, it would use a default input. Okay. So you use the actual inputs for the ones in that set and a default input for the one outside. Similarly, you would also compute another ciphertext with the red master public key, in which you would use the first three default inputs and the fourth one as what was received. So now the Genie created these two ciphertexts and gave it to the relevant parties, whoever was in that relevant set. And as an honest party, I would have got, for example, the ciphertext corresponding to the blue master public key. So I will just decode it using my secret key for F. And then I would be able to obtain the output. And the output that I'm getting in this case is on the real inputs of the first three parties and on the default input of the fourth one. Okay. So, but here you see that this, I will think a bit more, but I don't want to I just have few minutes left, so maybe we come back to that question. But so here you observe that the secret key for F, whatever decoding it's doing, so the response was just the ciphertext, and whatever local computation the party was doing after that, that is depending on the function, and then that's why it's a different sort of class of protocol than the one that we saw.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. And then here, actually, what is work is, so it's one call, that is obvious, but how much work is this Genie doing? So it's actually creating these ciphertexts. So the work will actually depend on the size of these ciphertexts. So now it depends on what kind of FE realization, functional encryption realization you're doing. If you take the scheme based on sub-exponential LWE, then that size of ciphertext will depend on the depth of the circuit. But if you take the one based on IO, then it would be just depending on the number of inputs, or like the N here and the security parameter. So if you base it on IO, it's truly small in some sense. And so this is a solution which is getting you guaranteed output delivery with one call. And so it seems all good, but one slightly good feature to have would be if we were not sending the inputs on clear to this Genie. Yes, we were considering this as a totally trusted service until now, but we started exploring that what happens if we think about this Genie as a semi-honest person instead of a totally honest person that you can give your inputs to. So if we look at a model in which the adversary is corrupting the Genie semi-honestly, and at the same time it's corrupting a majority of the parties maliciously, then in such a colluding model, we showed that fairness continues to remain impossible. So what we are saying is that even if you use this trusted party, but then you allow the adversary to corrupt it in a semi-honest manner, then you cannot circumvent cleave basically, and you cannot get fairness and God in dishonest majority. So next, that's why we thought like what we think, what happens when we go to this particular model of the non-colluding, in which we have two options, that either the TP is semi-honest or a majority of the parties are corrupt, but both of these things don't happen simultaneously. And actually, if you are considering the non-colluding model, then it is possible to get fairness and God. So we tried to strengthen our positive results by making it secure against this non-colluding model, because it's strictly better that you assume that it's possible that the Genie was semi-honest. So the way that you would tweak the same construction that we saw to make it secure against a semi-honest Genie is that the main idea is you try to hide the inputs using symmetric key encryption. So let me present what I mean. So what happens is that you have running this MPC with identifiable abort, but you are using it to compute these ciphertexts for every key, so for every input. So for every party, this MPC is picking a key, ki, and it's computing the ciphertext corresponding to its input xi. And as the output of the MPC, it's giving each party its respective key and its respective ciphertext. Okay. And the idea is that you will consider this related function g, whose circuit looks like this. So you can imagine this function having a circuit in which these ciphertexts are hard coded, and also the default inputs of the parties are hard coded. Okay. And it takes as input these symmetric keys, and it also takes as an additional input a bit vector. So it takes one bit, which is either 0 or 1 for every party. And what this circuit does is that it will set the inputs based on this bit. So if the bit of a party is 1, then it would set its input by decrypting the ciphertext using the key which was given as input. And then if the bit was 0, then it would simply set the input to the default input. So this is the logic of the circuit, that this is how it sets the inputs, and at the end it will output the function applied on the input set in this way. Okay, so this is a function that is sort of like an augmentation of f, in which you're setting the inputs in this particular way. The main idea is that now you will be using your functional encryption scheme not for f anymore, but for g instead. So what this will give is the setup information, master public key, and the secret key for this function g. Okay, and now what the parties do is that they send the master public key, but now they don't have to send their XIs anymore, because their input to this G would be the keys. So they would be sending the keys instead to this genie, who would, again, some of these keys could be potentially tampered. So as usual, the genie makes this partition, and when it's trying to compute the blue ciphertext with the blue master public key, then it would take the keys that it got for the first three, but for the fourth one, it would use a dummy key. And it also needs to initialize this bit vectors, because the entire input to G is 4 keys and 4 bits. So that's how the ciphertext should be prepared. So the 4 bits would be set with 1 for the first three and 0 for the last one, which is outside the set. Similarly, he will also create the red ciphertext with 3 dummy keys and 1 key K4, and similarly 3 zeros and 1 for the last party. So now it will send back these ciphertexts, and I mean, it's easy to see that if I'm one of the honest parties, then I would be decrypting the blue ciphertext, in which, by the logic of the circuit, I would be getting it evaluated on the real inputs of the first three parties and the default input of the fourth one. So this is the output is finally the same as the previous solution, but the main difference is that to the genie, you did not send your input on clear, but instead you send these keys from which he can not infer anything about your input. So this is the modification that we did to make it secure against the non-colluding model. So basically, this is the summary again, that we are trying to look at getting guaranteed output delivery in dishonest majority by making one call to a small TP. And we analyzed these two, one negative result related to the exponential size TP and one positive result based on the functional encryption. So that with that, I conclude my talk, and maybe we can discuss a bit more about that question. Yeah.